The path to unbreakable focus does not begin with techniques, productivity systems, or motivation. It begins with the collapse of a belief so old and familiar that most people never realize it was planted. From early childhood, you were taught, subtly but relentlessly, that the mind and the body exist in opposition. One was framed as refined, intelligent, thoughtful. The other as crude, physical, impulsive. Strength was portrayed as something that came at the cost of intelligence, and intelligence as something that thrived only when detached from physical power. This division appeared everywhere, in stories where the smart character was weak, in jokes where physical strength implied a lack of depth, in classrooms that rewarded stillness over resilience. Over time, this idea hardened into identity. You didn't consciously choose it. You adapted to it. You learned to lean into whichever side felt safer, more rewarded, more familiar. And in doing so, you unknowingly abandoned half of your capacity. This split was never harmless. A divided system cannot produce sustained focus. When the mind and body operate as separate entities, they constantly undermine one another. A sharp intellect trapped in an untrained body becomes cautious, hesitant, and overprotective. It calculates endlessly, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of consequence. A strong body guided by an undisciplined mind becomes reactive, forceful without precision, effort without direction. Both states appear functional on the surface, yet neither is complete. True focus, the kind that does not fracture under pressure, only emerges when intelligence has physical grounding and strength is guided by clarity. This integration was once understood intuitively. Ancient cultures did not romanticize division. They trained thinkers to endure hardship and warriors to cultivate insight. They knew that focus is not a mental trick but a physiological state supported by the entire system. Modern life has erased this understanding by removing immediate consequence. You can think endlessly without acting, plan endlessly without moving, and suffer no instant penalty. But the nervous system does not forget. When the body is unfamiliar with strain, it signals danger at the first hint of pressure. The mind, sensing that the body cannot carry the weight of consequence, pulls back. Focus scatters. Attention drifts. Action is delayed. This is often mislabeled as laziness or lack of discipline, but it is neither. It is misalignment. A system that has never been trained to endure cannot be expected to remain calm under demand. The mind hesitates not because it is weak, but because it is protecting a fragile vessel. The Japanese discipline at the core of elite focus does not attempt to silence the mind through force. It does not chase motivation or rely on emotion. Instead, it works at a deeper level by retraining the relationship between stress and survival. Through deliberate, repeated exposure to controlled discomfort, the body learns that pressure does not equal danger. Effort does not mean collapse. Discomfort does not require escape. This lesson is not intellectual. It is biological. And once the body learns it, the mind follows. Internal resistance fades. Focus sharpens not because you concentrate harder, but because there is nothing left to argue with. The nervous system stops sending false alarms, and attention stabilizes naturally. This is why the discipline feels forbidden. Not because it is hidden, but because it contradicts the modern promise of ease. It demands that you abandon the false choice between strength and intelligence and claim both. It requires you to give up the comfort of identity, "I'm just not built for that," and replace it with responsibility. Responsibility for your nervous system. Responsibility for your capacity under pressure. Responsibility for the fact that focus is not something you summon in moments of need, but something you install through consistent alignment. This first realization is unsettling because it removes excuses. But it is also liberating. Once the lie collapses, the path forward becomes unavoidable. Focus stops being a mystery and becomes a consequence of integration. If integration is the foundation of elite focus, then discipline is the mechanism that sustains it, and here is where most people misunderstand the Japanese way. Discipline, in the modern imagination, is associated with rigidity, punishment, and relentless self-denial. It is framed as something you impose on yourself through force of will, a daily battle between desire and restraint. This interpretation makes discipline fragile, because willpower is a limited resource and identity resists coercion. The Japanese discipline that reshapes focus operates under a different logic entirely. It is not about domination of the self, but alignment of the self. Instead of asking, "How do I force myself to focus?" it asks, "How do I make focus the natural outcome of my structure?" In traditional Japanese practice, structure always comes before intensity. Whether in martial arts, craftsmanship, or Zen training, the emphasis is placed on form, environment, and repetition rather than emotional drive. Musashi himself wrote that one should not rely on the heat of the moment, because emotion fluctuates and cannot be trusted. What can be trusted is form practiced so deeply that it functions without conscious thought. This is why Japanese masters do not chase motivation. Motivation spikes and crashes. Structure endures. When your environment, posture, breath, and rhythm are consistent, the mind has nothing to negotiate. It enters focus as a default state, not an achievement. The first forbidden element of this discipline is deliberate monotony. Modern culture treats boredom as a flaw to be eliminated, yet boredom is the gateway to depth. By repeating simple actions without variation, the nervous system stabilizes. The mind, deprived of novelty, stops scanning for stimulation and begins to settle. At first, this feels uncomfortable, even oppressive. Thoughts grow louder. Restlessness increases. This is not failure. It is exposure. You are encountering the untreated mind for the first time. Japanese discipline does not distract from this discomfort, it stays with it. Over time, the agitation exhausts itself, and a deeper layer of attention emerges, quiet, steady, and precise. The second element is constraint. Freedom, as it is commonly understood, fragments focus. Endless options create low-level anxiety, forcing the mind to remain in evaluation mode. Japanese systems intentionally limit choice to preserve clarity. The uniform in a dojo, the fixed movements of kata, the prescribed tools of a craftsman, these are not arbitrary traditions. They remove unnecessary decisions so energy can be directed toward mastery. Focus thrives when the mind is freed from constant selection. This is why elite performers often adopt rigid routines, not because they lack creativity, but because they are protecting their attention from dilution. Finally, there is the principle of restraint. Not repression, but restraint. Repression creates pressure, restraint creates control. In Musashi's philosophy, power held back is more valuable than power unleashed. The same applies to attention. When you train yourself not to react immediately, to impulses, distractions, discomfort, you develop a reserve of focus that remains intact under stress. This restraint is built through small, repeated acts, holding posture a moment longer, completing a task without interruption, allowing discomfort to pass without escape. Each act teaches the nervous system that urgency is not authority. Together, monotony, constraint, and restraint form a system that rewires focus at its root. They do not rely on inspiration or emotion. They rely on consistency and design. This is why the discipline feels inaccessible to modern minds. It offers no quick reward, no visible excitement, no external validation. But for those willing to endure the initial resistance, it delivers something far more valuable, a mind that no longer fractures under pressure, and a focus that remains steady regardless of circumstance. As this discipline deepens, a more unsettling truth begins to surface: distraction is not caused by the world, it is revealed by it. Most people believe their lack of focus comes from noise, technology, or external demands, but the Japanese tradition treats these as tests, not causes. A scattered mind does not become scattered because stimuli exist, it becomes scattered because it lacks internal hierarchy. When everything feels urgent, nothing is prioritized. The forbidden discipline corrects this not by eliminating distractions, but by strengthening the internal center from which attention is deployed. In Musashi's way, focus is directional, not absolute. You are not meant to block out everything at once. You are meant to place attention deliberately and hold it without leakage. This is why training emphasizes single-point awareness. Whether it is the tip of a sword, the rhythm of breath, or the placement of feet on the ground, attention is anchored to one reference point. The mind wanders, as it always will, but each return strengthens the muscle of focus. What changes is not the absence of distraction, but the speed and calmness of recovery. Elite focus is measured not by how long you never drift, but by how effortlessly you return. This is where modern productivity culture fails. It seeks to optimize output while ignoring the state of the nervous system producing it. Japanese discipline works in the opposite direction. It regulates the nervous system first, knowing that clarity follows automatically. Slow, controlled movements under tension teach the body to remain relaxed while engaged. Breath patterns stabilize heart rate. Posture aligns the spine, allowing signals to travel efficiently. These are not symbolic practices, they are biological instructions. When the body is ordered, the mind stops bracing for threat, and attention stops scattering. Another key element is the relationship with time. Western thinking treats time as an enemy to be conquered, compressed, and dominated. This creates constant urgency, which fragments focus. The Japanese approach treats time as a medium to move through with precision. There is no rush, only correctness. Musashi warned that haste creates blind spots. When you hurry, you sacrifice perception. When you slow down intentionally, perception expands. This does not make you less effective, it makes your actions cleaner, reducing wasted effort and corrective mistakes. Focus strengthens because it is no longer distorted by panic. At this stage, ego becomes the primary obstacle. The mind wants progress to be visible, dramatic, and acknowledged. Japanese discipline denies this gratification. Improvement is subtle and often invisible to others. This is intentional. When focus develops without external reward, it becomes self-sustaining. You are no longer practicing to prove something, but to refine perception. The absence of applause strips away performance anxiety, allowing attention to settle deeper. This is why traditional training often appears austere. Comfort and praise interfere with clarity. Over time, a shift occurs that feels almost paradoxical. As attention becomes narrower, awareness becomes broader. Because you are no longer mentally chasing everything, you begin to notice more. Sounds, movements, and changes in environment register without effort. This is the state Japanese masters describe as relaxed vigilance. You are not tense, yet nothing escapes you. Focus and awareness are no longer opposites, they are synchronized. This is the true function of the discipline. It does not create tunnel vision. It creates coherence. Your attention moves as one unit instead of fragmenting into competing impulses. When pressure arrives, there is no internal argument about where to look or what to do. Action flows from perception without delay. This is why the discipline feels dangerous to those unprepared for it. A mind this clear cannot be easily distracted, manipulated, or overwhelmed. And once experienced, it becomes impossible to accept the constant fragmentation that modern life presents as normal. As the discipline continues, the practitioner encounters a deeper layer of resistance that has nothing to do with distraction and everything to do with identity. At this stage, focus is no longer merely a skill being trained, it becomes a threat to the version of yourself you have relied on for years. The Japanese tradition understood that most inner conflict comes from misalignment between who you believe you are and what disciplined clarity demands of you. A scattered identity cannot support sustained focus. Every unresolved self-image competes for attention, pulling the mind in different directions. The discipline begins to dissolve these internal divisions, and that dissolution is uncomfortable. This is why the practice was never taught casually. When focus sharpens, excuses become visible. You can no longer hide behind confusion or claim uncertainty when you simply don't want to act. The mind, stripped of noise, sees its own avoidance clearly. This confrontation is what most people mistake for difficulty. It is not the training itself that is hard, it is the loss of plausible deniability. The discipline removes the mental fog that allowed hesitation to masquerade as caution. With clarity comes responsibility, and responsibility is heavier than distraction. Japanese masters addressed this by placing practitioners in repetitive, seemingly mundane routines. The purpose was not efficiency, but exposure. When the same action is repeated daily without variation, the mind runs out of novelty. What remains is raw internal dialogue. Restlessness surfaces. Impatience rises. The ego protests. This is not failure, it is the process working as intended. Focus is forged by staying present through boredom, not by chasing stimulation. When you stop reacting to the discomfort of repetition, attention stabilizes naturally. At this level, discipline also reshapes your relationship with effort. Instead of oscillating between bursts of intensity and collapse, effort becomes even and measured. The Japanese approach rejects extremes because extremes destabilize attention. Overexertion creates recovery debt, and recovery debt fractures focus. The goal is not maximum output, but maximum continuity. Small, precise effort applied daily outperforms sporadic intensity every time. This steadiness trains the nervous system to remain engaged without burnout, which is essential for long-term clarity. Another critical shift occurs in how mistakes are perceived. In modern culture, mistakes threaten identity, which triggers emotional reactions that scatter focus. In the Japanese discipline, mistakes are treated as neutral data. A misstep is simply information about alignment, timing, or perception. There is no drama attached to it. This emotional neutrality protects focus by preventing internal spirals. When attention is not consumed by self-judgment, it remains available for correction. Progress accelerates not because errors disappear, but because recovery from them becomes immediate. As focus deepens, silence takes on a new quality. It is no longer empty or uncomfortable. It becomes functional. Silence allows perception to sharpen without interference. This is why traditional training environments minimized unnecessary speech. Words pull attention outward. Silence turns it inward. Over time, the practitioner learns to carry this silence internally even in noisy environments. External chaos loses its authority because the internal reference point is stable. Focus becomes portable rather than conditional. This stage also reveals why the discipline is often described as forbidden. A person with stable focus is difficult to control. They are less reactive to fear-based messaging, less seduced by constant stimulation, and less dependent on external validation. Such individuals do not move in predictable patterns. Historically, systems of power preferred compliant populations over coherent ones. The discipline was preserved quietly, passed through lineages that valued inner sovereignty over social approval. By the end of this phase, focus is no longer something you apply. It is something you inhabit. You do not force attention onto tasks, tasks receive attention naturally because there is no competing internal noise. The mind feels quieter, but not dull. It feels precise. This precision creates a sense of inevitability in action. When you decide to act, the decision carries weight because it emerges from a unified system. This is the foundation upon which the later, more demanding stages are built, and without it, higher discipline collapses under pressure. At this stage, the discipline begins to alter how intention forms inside you. Earlier, intention felt like something you had to summon, a mental effort to push yourself toward action. Now intention arises more quietly, almost automatically, because the internal resistance that once opposed it has been reduced. The Japanese understanding of focus recognizes that willpower is unreliable when the system is divided. True focus emerges only when intention no longer has to fight against fear, fatigue, or self-doubt. What you experience here is not increased effort, but reduced friction. This is where the concept of readiness becomes central. Readiness is not motivation, and it is not excitement. It is the state of being prepared to act without emotional negotiation. In traditional training, readiness was cultivated through consistency rather than intensity. Every repetition, every controlled breath, every deliberate movement was a signal to the nervous system that action is normal, not exceptional. Over time, this removes the psychological drama surrounding effort. Tasks no longer feel heavy before they begin. The mind stops inflating their difficulty in advance. Another subtle shift occurs in how you perceive challenge. Earlier, difficulty triggered internal questioning: can I handle this? What if I fail? What will this cost me? Now, challenge is registered more neutrally. It is recognized as a condition, not a threat. This neutrality preserves focus because attention is no longer diverted towards self-protection. The body has learned, through repeated exposure, that discomfort does not equal danger. As a result, the mind remains present instead of projecting worst-case scenarios. This is also the point where the discipline begins to influence your emotional range. Emotions still arise, but they no longer hijack attention. Instead of reacting immediately, there is a brief internal pause, a moment of space in which choice becomes possible. This pause is not learned through intellectual control, but through physiological regulation. A calm nervous system creates room for conscious response. Focus benefits because it is no longer constantly interrupted by emotional spikes. In Japanese tradition, this capacity was considered more valuable than raw intelligence. A sharp mind without emotional regulation is unstable under pressure. The discipline corrects this imbalance by grounding cognition in the body. When the breath remains steady and posture remains aligned, the mind receives continuous feedback that the situation is manageable. This feedback loop stabilizes attention. Focus becomes durable rather than brittle. As readiness deepens, you begin to notice a reduction in internal commentary. The constant narration that once accompanied every action fades. You are less concerned with how things appear and more engaged with how they are done. This shift conserves mental energy. Without the need to constantly explain or justify your actions to yourself, attention remains available for execution. Work becomes quieter, more direct. This stage also exposes the difference between discipline and control. Control relies on force and suppression. Discipline relies on structure and trust. You no longer need to clamp down on impulses because many of them no longer arise. The system has been trained to favor what aligns with your standards. This makes focus sustainable over long periods without exhaustion. There is no internal battle draining resources. As this pattern stabilizes, the practitioner begins to experience a form of confidence that is difficult to articulate. It is not optimism, and it is not bravado. It is the calm certainty that action is possible under less than ideal conditions. This certainty anchors focus even when variables change. You do not lose clarity when plans shift because your sense of capability is internal, not dependent on predictability. The groundwork has been laid for deeper integration, where focus and action become indistinguishable. At this level, the discipline begins to reveal its most misunderstood aspect: restraint. Earlier stages required effort to build focus, but now the greater challenge is knowing when not to act. As clarity increases, so does capability. You see more options, detect patterns faster, and recognize opportunities others miss. Without restraint, this expanded perception can scatter attention again, pulling you into unnecessary battles, conversations, or projects. Japanese discipline treats restraint as a form of strength, not limitation. Focus is protected not by doing more, but by refusing what does not deserve your energy. This is where the principle of economy enters. Every action has a cost, not only in time, but in nervous system load. The discipline teaches you to sense this cost intuitively. You begin to feel when an action will drain clarity rather than enhance it. This sensitivity is not hesitation, it is precision. Instead of reacting impulsively, you allow a brief pause to assess alignment. If an action does not serve the larger direction, it is discarded without guilt. Focus strengthens because it is no longer diluted by unnecessary expenditure. At this stage, discipline also reshapes how you relate to urgency. Urgency once felt external, imposed by deadlines, expectations, or pressure from others. Now you recognize that most urgency is manufactured. True urgency is rare and unmistakable. Everything else is noise attempting to hijack attention. The Japanese approach trains you to move decisively without haste. Speed becomes situational rather than habitual. When speed is required, you act without delay. When it is not, you remain still without anxiety. This flexibility keeps focus intact under varying conditions. Another transformation occurs in your relationship with silence. Silence is no longer merely a refuge from noise, it becomes an active tool. You use it to reset attention, to let perception catch up with action. In conversation, silence allows others to reveal more. In decision-making, silence prevents premature commitment. This deliberate use of silence stabilizes focus by preventing reactive behavior. You are no longer compelled to fill gaps with words or actions. Stillness becomes a form of control. Physiologically, this phase is marked by a deeper regulation of stress responses. Challenges still elevate heart rate and adrenaline, but these signals no longer cascade into panic or overthinking. The nervous system has learned to interpret stimulation as information rather than alarm. This allows the mind to remain clear even as intensity rises. Focus does not collapse under pressure, it sharpens. This is the state ancient warriors trained for, not the absence of fear, but the ability to function cleanly in its presence. With this regulation comes a shift in how you experience fatigue. Fatigue no longer automatically signals the need to stop. It becomes a data point to be evaluated. Sometimes it means rest is required. Sometimes it means adaptation is needed. The discipline teaches discernment rather than rigid rules. This discernment preserves focus by preventing both reckless overexertion and premature withdrawal. You learn to operate near the edge of capacity without crossing into dysfunction. As restraint becomes natural, your external behavior changes subtly. You speak less but with more intention. You move with fewer wasted gestures. Decisions appear simpler because you are no longer entertaining every possibility. This simplicity is not ignorance, it is refinement. Focus benefits because attention is directed toward what matters most instead of being fragmented across endless options. This stage also introduces a quiet form of authority. Not authority over others, but over your own impulses. You are no longer driven by the need to respond, react, or prove. This internal authority creates stability. When others are pulled into urgency or emotional escalation, you remain grounded. Your focus becomes an anchor point, not only for yourself, but often for those around you. By the end of this phase, the discipline feels less like a practice and more like a filter through which life is experienced. Events no longer overwhelm you with competing demands. They pass through a clear internal structure that determines what receives attention and what does not. Focus, at this level, is no longer fragile. It is protected by restraint, maintained by regulation, and guided by purpose. This prepares the ground for the later stages, where focus evolves beyond personal performance and begins shaping responsibility, leadership, and long-term direction. At this stage, focus begins to extend beyond the boundaries of the self and into responsibility. Earlier, the discipline was about stabilizing your own mind and nervous system. Now it starts shaping how you carry weight in the world. Responsibility is not imposed from outside, it is recognized internally. You become aware that your clarity, or lack of it, directly affects outcomes, decisions, and people around you. This awareness does not create pressure. It creates seriousness. Focus deepens because distraction now has consequences you can feel. The Japanese tradition never separated focus from duty. A disciplined mind was not an end in itself but a prerequisite for being trusted. When your attention is stable, others can rely on you. This reliability is not about perfection. It is about consistency under uncertainty. You no longer disappear mentally when conditions become difficult. You remain present, observant, and responsive. This presence is what allows responsibility to be carried without resentment. As responsibility increases, ego becomes quieter rather than louder. There is less interest in being seen and more interest in being accurate. Focus shifts from self-expression to correct action. You stop asking how something reflects on you and start asking whether it is right. This removes a significant drain on attention. Self-consciousness fragments focus. Purpose consolidates it. At this level, decision-making becomes more weighted. You understand that every choice reinforces a pattern, not just an outcome. Because of this, you choose with care but not with hesitation. You do not rush decisions, yet you do not avoid them. The discipline has taught you to tolerate uncertainty without freezing. Focus remains intact because you are no longer seeking perfect information, only sufficient clarity to act. Another shift occurs in how you relate to others' expectations. You listen carefully, but you are no longer governed by approval or disapproval. The internal standard established earlier now guides behavior. This independence protects focus by preventing it from being pulled in multiple social directions. You can hear conflicting demands without becoming confused by them. Clarity allows you to prioritize without guilt. There is also a growing awareness of timing. Not everything must be addressed immediately, and not everything can wait. Focus at this stage includes patience. You learn to let situations develop rather than forcing resolution prematurely. This patience is not passivity, it is strategic restraint. You act when your intervention will have the greatest effect. This sensitivity to timing preserves energy and sharpens impact. As focus matures, your relationship with control changes. You no longer attempt to manage everything. You manage yourself and allow systems to function. This reduces mental load significantly. When you stop carrying what does not belong to you, attention becomes available for what does. Responsibility becomes sustainable rather than overwhelming. By the end of this phase, focus feels anchored in purpose rather than effort. You are no longer concentrated because you are trying to be disciplined. You are concentrated because what you are doing matters. This sense of meaning stabilizes attention more deeply than any technique. Distraction loses its appeal when your actions are aligned with responsibility. Focus becomes quiet, steady, and reliable, setting the stage for the final stages where discipline turns into leadership and long-term influence. At this stage, focus evolves into something broader and more subtle: stewardship. You are no longer simply responsible for your own actions or outcomes, you begin to recognize that the state you maintain influences the environments you move through. This does not mean controlling others or imposing discipline outwardly. It means understanding that your clarity, calm, and consistency shape the tone of situations more than words ever could. Focus becomes less about personal performance and more about maintaining a stable center that others unconsciously orient around. The Japanese tradition placed immense value on this quality, though it was rarely named directly. A person who could remain internally ordered in disorder was considered trustworthy. Their presence reduced chaos rather than amplifying it. This effect does not come from charisma or authority in the conventional sense. It comes from coherence. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions are aligned, the signal you emit is clean. Others feel it immediately, even if they cannot explain why. Focus at this level is no longer private, it becomes ambient. One of the most noticeable changes here is how you handle tension in group settings. Where others react emotionally, rush to fill silence, or escalate conflict, you remain composed. This composure is not detachment. It is containment. You allow tension to exist without feeding it. By not adding noise, you give situations room to resolve themselves. This restraint preserves focus not only within you but within the space itself. Problems become easier to solve when they are not emotionally inflated. Another shift occurs in communication. You speak less, but when you do, your words carry weight. This is not because you are trying to be persuasive, but because your internal state supports what you say. Your body, breath, and timing align with your language. There is no contradiction between your message and your presence. Focus here includes the discipline of saying only what is necessary. Unnecessary speech disperses attention. Precision concentrates it. At this level, you also become more sensitive to the cost of disorder. You notice how chaotic environments, unclear expectations, and inconsistent standards drain energy. Instead of complaining about these conditions, you quietly correct what is within your control. You clarify expectations. You simplify processes. You model steadiness. This is how focus becomes structural rather than situational. You are no longer dependent on ideal conditions to function well, you help create them. Internally, the mind grows quieter still. Not because there is nothing to think about, but because thinking has become more purposeful. You are no longer reacting to every stimulus. You choose what deserves reflection. This selectivity protects focus from being consumed by trivial matters. Mental energy is conserved for decisions and actions that have lasting impact. There is also a refinement in how you relate to ambition. Earlier stages may have been driven by improvement or mastery. Now ambition becomes less urgent and more deliberate. You are not chasing outcomes to validate yourself. You are building something durable. This long-term orientation stabilizes focus because it removes the pressure of immediate results. You can work patiently, knowing that consistency will compound. As stewardship deepens, you become more aware of the limits of force. Pushing harder is no longer the default solution. You recognize when influence is better applied through example, timing, or silence. This discernment preserves focus by preventing unnecessary expenditure of effort. Energy is directed where it matters most. By the end of this phase, focus feels less like concentration and more like presence. You are fully engaged without being tense. You are attentive without being rigid. This presence has a grounding effect on both your own actions and the environments you inhabit. The discipline has moved beyond internal alignment and begun shaping external reality through steadiness rather than control. This prepares the way for the final refinement, where focus and identity merge completely, and discipline becomes a quiet, enduring force rather than a visible practice. At this stage, focus matures into self-governance. You are no longer responding to rules, routines, or external structures to stay aligned. The structure now lives inside you. Decisions are made from an internal order that does not require constant reinforcement. This is where the discipline becomes truly autonomous. You do not need reminders to act correctly. You feel when something is out of alignment, and you correct it without drama or delay. One of the clearest signs of this phase is the absence of inner argument. Earlier, action required negotiation with doubt, fatigue, or resistance. Now, those voices have largely lost their authority. They may still appear, but they no longer dominate. Focus is preserved because attention is not consumed by debate. You act, adjust, and move forward. This efficiency is not mechanical, it is intelligent. You are responsive rather than reactive. Time is experienced differently here. You are no longer chasing it or feeling pursued by it. You move within it deliberately. Deadlines inform action but do not generate panic. Waiting no longer feels like wasted time, it feels like positioning. This temporal stability supports focus because urgency is no longer constantly pulling attention into the future. You remain anchored in the present while acting with foresight. Emotionally, there is a noticeable steadiness. Highs do not intoxicate you, and lows do not destabilize you. This does not mean emotional numbness. It means emotional proportionality. Feelings arise, but they are processed within a stable framework. Focus benefits because attention is not hijacked by emotional extremes. You can remain clear even when circumstances are challenging. At this level, discipline has fully replaced motivation. Motivation may still appear, but it is no longer required to function. You do not wait to feel ready. Readiness is assumed. This makes action consistent across varying conditions. Whether energy is high or low, the standard remains. Focus becomes reliable because it is not contingent on mood. There is also a refinement in judgment. You become better at distinguishing what deserves your attention from what does not. You no longer confuse importance with urgency or noise with relevance. This discernment allows you to conserve mental energy and apply it precisely. Focus is no longer spread thin. It is concentrated where it creates the most impact. Interpersonally, people begin to treat you differently. Not because you demand authority, but because your consistency and clarity make you dependable. Your reactions are predictable in the best sense. You do not overreact, and you do not disappear under pressure. This reliability creates trust. Focus at this stage supports not only your own effectiveness but the stability of those who depend on you. By the end of this phase, focus feels inseparable from character. It is not something you practice in isolation, it informs how you think, speak, and decide. The discipline has matured into self-leadership. You govern your attention the way a skilled ruler governs a state, quietly, firmly, and with long-term stability in mind. What remains is not striving, but stewardship of the system you have built, preparing for the final stage where discipline becomes a way of being rather than an activity. At the final stage, focus is no longer experienced as effort, discipline, or even self-control. It becomes a natural expression of who you are. There is no sense of struggle between intention and action because that conflict has dissolved. Thought, decision, and movement arise from the same center. This is not a dramatic transformation marked by intensity or constant achievement. It is quiet, stable, and deeply rooted. You do what needs to be done because it would feel unnatural not to. In this state, attention rests easily on whatever is in front of you. There is no need to force concentration or protect it aggressively. Distractions still exist, but they no longer pull you away. They pass through awareness without leaving residue. Focus is sustained not by resistance, but by alignment. You are present because nothing inside you is competing for control. This is what the Japanese tradition pointed toward when it spoke of mastery without tension. Your relationship with effort also changes completely. Effort is no longer associated with strain. It becomes a neutral application of energy. You work without rushing and rest without guilt. Both states are complete. This balance preserves clarity over long periods of time. Burnout is unlikely here because there is no internal conflict draining resources. The system is self-regulating. At this level, discipline is invisible. Others may notice consistency, calm, or reliability, but they do not see the structure that produces it. You are no longer concerned with being recognized for discipline. Recognition is irrelevant because the reward is internal coherence. You trust yourself, and that trust removes the need for external validation. Focus is maintained because it is no longer defended, it is lived. There is also a deep acceptance of impermanence. You understand that clarity must be maintained, not assumed. You do not cling to past progress or identity. Each day is approached as practice, not because you fear regression, but because practice is how alignment stays alive. This humility protects focus from complacency. When challenges arise, they are met without emotional excess. Difficulty is not personalized. It is contextual. You adapt, respond, and continue. This resilience is not heroic, it is procedural. Your system is designed to recover quickly. Focus returns naturally after disruption because returning has been practiced thousands of times. At the end of this path, the forbidden discipline reveals its final truth. It was never about becoming extraordinary. It was about becoming whole. Focus emerges as a byproduct of unity, not a goal pursued in isolation. When the mind and body move together, attention no longer fractures. It flows. This is why the discipline was preserved quietly and passed selectively. A person who is internally unified cannot be easily manipulated, rushed, or destabilized. Their presence carries weight without aggression. Their actions are deliberate without hesitation. This is unbreakable focus, not because nothing can challenge it, but because nothing inside is working against it.